Hi there. Welcome back to Real Film Chronicles. As always, I'm Nathan.
My name is Brian.
This is episode 13 in which we discuss the movie Censor.
Fantastic. This is a new movie, 2021. I'm not sure what the situation was of its release. Probably released in a couple film festivals. I don't know if it was released just online. Man, I haven't done my research on this. I was just so excited to see. I was pulled in by the cover art on it. I think someone on my Letterboxd friends list watched it, reviewed it. I saw the cover art. It's like, oh, what is this? Read a quick overview. And yeah, I'm basically watching this film. So before we get into spoilers, we're going to talk a little bit about our initial viewing of the movie, our initial response to it, and our recommendation. And then we'll pop into spoiler territory with fair warning to everyone who hasn't seen the movie. But to get started with, let's talk about the overview here, which might be a bit spoilery as it is, but, you know, this is out there. Film censor Enid takes pride in her meticulous work, guarding unsuspected audience from the deleterious effects of watching the gore-filled decapitations and eye gougings she pores over. Her sense of duty to protect is amplified by guilt over her inability to recall details of the long-ago disappearance of her sister, recently declared dead in absentia. When Enid is assigned to review a disturbing film from the archive that echoes her hazy childhood memories, she begins to unravel how this eerie work might be tied to her past. Fantastic. So what were your initial thoughts? I think I forced you to watch this early on, maybe about a week or so ago. What did you think of this movie?
So as soon as you told me about this movie, I went and checked out the trailer. And kudos to whoever put this trailer together, to the marketing team for this movie, because those trailers were amazing. Like, they instantly sold me on this film. And then again, on your recommendation, it wasn't like a Clockwork Orange kind of thing where you strapped me down and forced me to watch this thing. But yeah, on your recommendation, I checked this out, and I really enjoyed it. It was really great at setting a certain mood. It was set in this very specific time period. I think it was the 70s or the 80s in England, the time of the video nasties.
The 80s, yeah.
The 80s, yeah. It was. I should have known that. I think there was like a brief reference to the Evil Dead in there. It would have been the 80s. But yeah, this was a great. I guess it was more kind of a psychological thriller necessarily than a straight up horror movie. So like that plot description describes it kind of describes what literally happens, but the real meat and potatoes is in really the psychological horror of kind of what's going on. Sure. and watching Enid as she slowly kind of unravels, which is really the horror as she kind of slowly succumbs to her own, I guess, insanity.
Yeah, that's a pretty fair assessment. Yeah.
But yeah, it worked great as a kind of a meta commentary on filmmaking. So this is one of those films about filmmaking, but with a horror / thriller bent. And I thought that was really, really neat the way they worked that idea about filmmaking and worked it into, we'll get into it later, but the kind of a metaphor for what was going on psychologically with Enid and setting against that backdrop in the 80s with the video nasties in England. I think that was a really, really smart move to really sell all the themes and everything going on. But yeah, it was really, really good. I was pleasantly surprised.
And so, from the sounds of it, you probably recommend this film for, if you're into horror, you're gonna psychological, especially, you're gonna enjoy this movie.
I would definitely recommend this film. Both, I think it works doubly well if you're a fan of horror, and especially if you're, I don't want to say a certain age, because you can certainly enjoy older movies if you weren't alive when they were originally released, or if you were young. But I think if you are of a certain age and you remember that time period of kind of that moral panic and, issues about censorship and that specific period of films, right? I think they specifically reference some actual real world films in there. It's kind of nostalgic. There's a certain kind of nostalgia built in there as well. So like if you're a hardcore horror and like that, not just like the horror like we talk about today is like, oh yeah, The Conjuring and Insidious and like the mainstream horror, but the really kind of exploitation horror that was
Yeah,
really pushing
exactly.
boundaries of taste and audience's gag reflex and that kind of thing, right?
Yeah, and that's it exactly. Is the video nasties, this era in the '80s where the British, the UK governments were kind of cracking down on a lot of indie films that were really just there to kind of push the limits of what they could get away with. So it's just kind of like grotesque and violent acts on screen just for the sake of being violent and not necessarily pushing different boundaries that have any possible merit. And I don't want to kind of like belittle what these films are, but there is a lot of exploitation films being put out there just for the sake of it, right? And I think that's kind of what we get into here. Seeing this movie in that context was really fascinating. Most movies we see about the film industry, behind the scenes is sort of the epicness behind them. They're usually set in further back times, where here we kind of have a different setting in the 80s about a time of censorship, right? It just comes at a different angle. As you said, it absolutely tackles the themes of the film perfectly. Like, I think this movie was just beautifully written. I think it was shot really well. I just loved all these throwbacks to a lot of 70s and 80s horror films. Just, I think the way the movie was shot in certain stocks of film as well. They did a lot of interesting stuff. I was hooked on this movie from the very beginning. It was like I went in with not really much expectation, but I was looking forward to it. I skipped the trailer, just seeing a couple reviews on it online and seeing the poster was enough to get me in. And it's one of these movies now where I'm hooked. I'm not paying attention to my phone. I'm watching it from start to finish. And it's not a particularly long movie, right? It's just under 90 minutes. I think it's it's about an hour, 25 minutes. It moves along pretty briskly. It's really interesting. And the ending just goes absolutely to the wall. I loved every second of it. It's a definite recommend for me for any fan of horror, without a doubt. But really, as children of the 80s, this was going on in the 80s. I think this is kind of important to put into context here. The video nasties, where there was increased crime and like violent crime in the UK during this time, and a lot of it was being blamed on movies and these exploitation films. So there's a lot of pressure from the government to censor these movies and effectively restrict the release. And there's quite a few notable films in that list as well. I don't know if you've seen some of these, but it sounds like they sort of effectively place them into three different lists or three different categories, whereas, to be fair here, I'm just reading from Wikipedia. Section 1, the Section 1 list movies are prosecuted films, where I'm not 100% sure what prosecuted means, but you have something like Cannibal Holocaust in there.
I was going to say, yeah.
And I think the movie that they reference that starts it all is The Driller Killer, which I think came out in 1979. I haven't seen that one. I don't recognize a few of these, but you'll probably recognize I Spit on Your Grave,
Yep.
The Last House on the Left as well. Which definitely pushing the boundaries of like what is obscene in cinemas, right? And so a lot of these ones, it was really interesting reading this list and seeing they were banned from release. And it wasn't until like maybe 20 years later that a lot of them ended up seeing release. There's a second section called non-prosecuted films, which included The Evil Dead. Like the note here says, originally passed with cuts for cinema, released with approximately 2 minutes cut in 1990 on home release, and then re-released uncut in 2001. So if you were in the UK and you were playing by the rules here, there's no way to get The Evil Dead in an uncut version until 2001, which, we're in our 20s by then, and I can't imagine missing out on that for so long. And then there's a series of films that they specifically called video nasties, like Dawn of the Dead, Deep Red, The Demons, Eaten Alive. There's a few of them in there. Friday the 13th, Part 1 and 2 were in there, where you could get in some trouble. They would confiscate these films, but you're not necessarily going to be charged for
Right.
having them in your collection, right? But what an interesting thing. When we, North American children here, we didn't see that type of censorship, right? Most of our censorship is more towards nudity and sex than it is violence and gore, where violence and gore are a little more normalized in our region.
Yeah, it's also interesting how this debate about media influence on behavior, specifically like criminal or negative behavior, has been an ongoing kind of every new medium. There's been a lot of pearl clutching and claims as, oh no, that's corrupting the minds of the youth, and we see the same kind of dialogue going on today a lot with video games. But you saw it also at some point with different points in history with music, so it's really interesting seeing that specific time and place, but really there's kind of a universality about it where there's that debate that's still ongoing in our culture, right?
Yeah. And in this case, the entire industry is affected by these, the blame that these movies are the cause of these violent crimes. And the movie does make mention of the amnesia killer, which I'm assuming is kind of a fictitious thing in here. But essentially the journalists link his killings to a movie that recently passed the censors and was, available for home viewing. But they also make mention that the primary motivation for the video nasties, these banned films and censorship, was to keep the hands out of children because it's the advent of home video. And so they mentioned video cassettes becoming available. Being able to restrict who enters a cinema, like a theater, is one thing, but when you bring a video cassette into a home, who is responsible for making sure these children don't put that videotape in? Like what I read somewhere, The Exorcist was one of these video nasties as well, on the reasoning that the main girl is under 12 years old, so children would want to see movies with other children in it, and they would end up putting The Exorcist on, right? Which kind of seems absurd now that, any parent or guardian would allow their children to put on a movie like The Exorcist, but the government took it upon themselves to take that responsibility out of parents' hands.
Well, yeah, it's interesting the point you brought up in terms of the historical context of the time period that Censor set in is also like it's VHS was a hugely and beta, right? But essentially home video was like a hugely disruptive technology. It was a huge technological shift. So anytime there's a huge shift in technology, there has to be like a commensurate kind of social shift and how to properly integrate that new technology in with society, right? And so there's going to be growing pains. And so this kind of sense of kind of social / technological unrest essentially frames the entire narrative of Censor, both narratively and thematically, I think.
Yeah, without a doubt. So obviously, I think it's fair to say there'll be spoilers for the movie from here on out.
Wait, did you say you recommended this movie or not, Brian? I can't quite recall.
This is a hard recommend. We'll give our star ratings for the film after we finish talking about it. But yeah, I really love this movie. I think it's great.
For horror fans, for sure. Would you recommend it to a wider audience?
Yes, for sure.
Just fans of cinema in general?
You know what? I'm not really sure. I mean, the movie gets pretty weird. It sort of ventures on that tough to consume aspect.
Definitely the ending gets very surreal, right? It ventures into that surrealist aspect.
I think that's where I would have difficulty recommending it to wider audiences. Like if you're into horror, by now you've probably seen some horror films with strange endings that may not make a lot of sense. These endings are open for interpretation, right? But kind of might leave you hanging for a little bit. And I think a wider audience, if you don't like some ambiguous endings or even confusing ones, you got to prepare yourself for that going into this film, right? And I think the movie sort of goes, I don't want to say off the rails because the movie was on rails for me the entire time. But if you are coming at this in a more casual way, I think it's literally about 50 minutes in, 1 hour, 60 minutes in. It takes a hard turn into that surrealism.
Yeah, it makes sense in the context of the movie, but
Mhm.
the kind of the style of the movie shifts a little bit, and for mainstream audiences, maybe that's not the easiest to digest. But I think for horror fans, for sure, this is going to be a great, or for anybody who loves, I would say like more artistic cinema experiences, right? Where you're not adverse to a little bit more ambiguity, where the movie makes you work a little bit harder to kind of work out the answers yourself. Then yeah, absolutely, this is right up your alley.
Yeah, well, what is the term that's going around recently? Like the elevated horror? I'm not sure that I would apply this
Oh, elevated
to
horror.
elevated horror,
Quite.
right?
What would be considered
But
elevated horror? What does that mean?
I'm thinking movies like Hereditary and Midsommar,
Okay.
even The Witch.
Well, I do
But
love those
I feel like those
movies.
movies, those are great movies, and I feel like they're fairly accessible to everyone. Midsommar is probably a little more difficult by the end, but something like Color Out of Space, it ventures into that surreal, what is going on in my brain when I'm watching this movie, where I think this one kind of tends to as well, right? But I'm awful at comparing movies like that, putting them into these categories. It's a tough one for me.
Well, you picked the right hobby then, reviewing movies on the podcast.
Right? The secret is out. I really don't know what I'm talking about most of the time.
Welcome to adulthood, I guess.
This is why I always ask you the questions first.
All right. So with that being said, we're going to get into spoilers here as we go in depth in this film.
100%. Yeah. Spoiler city at this point. Let's go for it.
There be spoilers.
So, I mean, I think we sort of understand from the overview that the movie is following Enid, who is a film censor working for the, censorship board or whatever organization it is.
Yeah. Can we just want to give a shout out to the actor here, Neve Algar. She was phenomenal in this.
Yes.
And I want to see her in more movies as soon as possible. She was also in The Wolfwalkers. I know
Wolfwalkers. Oh, nice.
Favorite of yours. She does one of the voices. I can't remember which character it was, but she was in there.
And she was also in Wrath of Man, which we covered in our previous episode.
Oh, no way. No, was she?
Yeah.
She was the bank employee that he... Oh, I can't believe I missed that. Oh yeah, I want to see her in more stuff. She did a phenomenal job in taking this. There's some really subtle aspects of that character Enid. Obviously there's a psychological struggle there, and like all the subtle stuff, and then when it gets to the end and things go kind of all nuts and insane, and she does a great job at going over the top as well.
And it's directed. This is the directorial debut of Prano Bailey-Bond. She did a couple short films before this, including one called Nasty, which I assume Censor's going to be loosely based on and expanded upon. So I think after this, I'll probably try and track down those short films. Maybe they're on YouTube or something.
That's another thing. I'm glad you brought that up, that this was a debut film. It's like,
yeah,
there are directors out there would kill to have a debut film like this. Like this was
without a doubt,
like
right?
This looked like the work of a seasoned professional with you think that there was like decades of films before this that they put out, but like, no, this is a debut film.
Yeah.
It's like, and what a way to kind of make an entrance into the horror world, right? Right. It makes the movie even more impressive when you think about it like that.
Yeah, amazing. Did you want to take us through a little bit of the plot here, like how we get started? Or
right. So the movie starts out with Enid and her fellow censors, and it kind of shows, I don't know, was it The Driller Killer? Was that the first movie that they were watching? Or was it?
I think most of the movies that they feature in this film were kind of stand-ins for the real films. I think they, like The Driller Killer sounds familiar, but I'm just not sure if that's from looking up the movies afterwards.
Yeah, I think the one scene they showed where like they were drilling into the guy's skull, and I haven't actually seen The Driller Killer. I think that wasn't the movie that she was editing. There was a movie that she was editing, and essentially what happens is she and another person are editing this movie or deciding like how it should be kind of edited down, right, as censors. And so they're giving notes back, and then but they okayed it with these edits, right? I think that was the movie. There was a whole big meeting with all the censors there and like the head of the department, and it was like, are we going to release this? And it came down to a vote, and essentially Enid and that gentleman there who was working with her, I can't remember the character's name.
Well, it was an interesting thing because the one guy suggests, well, if we make this one little cut, he would pass it.
Yeah.
And essentially they're kind of pressured into, no, let's just restrict the movie. Like they're essentially just effectively banning the film instead.
So either way, this film gets released in a form where there's very graphic violence. And then the next day or a couple days later, a couple weeks later, I can't remember the time frame, but there's a killing in the real world that very closely mirrors a killing that happened in the movie that they released, which was specifically, I guess, the gentleman killed his wife and ate her face, I think it was, which was an exact scene from this movie. And so immediately the media put together, made this connection between the movie and the killings. And for some reason, they figured out the two censors who were the chief censors on that movie. And there was Enid and her partner in crime there. And so all of a sudden they're getting pushback, which in the real world, I'm not sure that would happen. I think there'd be more pushback against the actual filmmakers who actually made these things as opposed to the censorship board. But for the purposes of the story, it helps move things along and it ups the dramatic stakes. But then, of course, Enid is, trying, because she seems like she's one of the more conservative ones there, where she's very, very meticulous, right? I think the one thing she keeps saying is, I just want to make sure I get it right. I just want to get it right.
Well, it's shown that she can separate her emotion from the content she's watching, right? Like she's kind of cold in the way that she looks at these films. Like it doesn't seem to affect her at all, which I think is important for.
Yeah, she's able to compartmentalize, but she's also, she's a normal human being with normal empathy. So of course she's like horrified that even though she doesn't, I don't think that she actually thinks that there's a connection between the media that they're putting out and the actual killing. She still, obviously she starts to question herself because real people are suffering. She's like, could I possibly have a part to play in this? And so that starts to frame some of the dialogue about that interplay between media and behavior, but it also starts to set Enid down this path where she starts to slowly kind of unravel psychologically, right? Like that's the first thread that kind of starts to pull loose.
Yeah, exactly.
And I think it's early on in the film like this. I can't remember whether it's Enid or somebody else who specifically makes the connection between the editing process and the censorship process and human memory.
Okay.
Because that could be later on, I'm thinking of, but there was one character who specifically makes the connection between, human memory kind of functions the same way as censors do, where we pick and choose like we're picking where we make the cuts to make the movie inside our head as palatable to the individual audience of one, right? And so that kind of that helps to really put the whole movie in context too, right? Where you see like, oh, the censorship, that job is really a metaphor for Enid's psychology and her kind of psychological journey.
Yeah, and I think it's her coworker later on, like after they go through a film. I think his quote is, "It's surprising what the brain can edit out." And the choice of words is very deliberate in that sense, because in the beginning of the film as well, Enid is getting these flashbacks of her childhood, and specifically the day that her sister went missing. And we could also point out the people who know that she was the censor on this film, like that's supposed to be confidential information.
Yes.
Plays into the next part where a director sends their movie in to get processed in this censor board, Frederick North, and he specifically requests that Enid reviews his film. And the film is called Don't Go in the Church.
Yes.
And plays out like identically to what the flashbacks we've witnessed so far from Enid's mind. So it plays out in the same way, where these two girls are sort of at a cabin in the woods.
Yeah. So sorry. The other thing, really, to put things in context, is like Enid's dealing with this blowback from the public for the connection between her movie and what they're dubbing the amnesia killer, killing his wife. I think his whole family. He kills the kids too, but he eats the wife's face. It's like as one. I mean, if you're insane, it's like why not? I guess go nuts. But yeah, the other part of it is we learn that Enid's sister went missing when they were very young, and we see it at a dinner where Enid's parents, years later, this is like decades later, they finally like have her declared legally dead, just to kind of get some emotional closure. But we see that Enid is not ready for that, right? She obviously still has some unresolved psychological issues that are related to the disappearance of her sister. And the whole thing was that the two girls, right, Enid and her sister Alice, I think it is.
Yes. The sister's name is Nina.
Nina. Yeah. Sorry. I'm thinking of a different character. Yeah. So Enid and Nina, not a tongue twister at all. They go off in the woods to play and we don't really get the full story of what happens, but really Enid's the only one who comes back and Nina disappears. They don't find a body and the parents question Enid, but she can't remember anything. And it's assumed that it's through some kind of trauma. But this really provides a context as well for what's going on, right? So she gets sent this film, like you were saying, Brian, Don't Go in the Church, I love that name too. It's such a great name for a little horror film. And it's mirroring kind of these flashbacks that she's been having. And it's like these two little girls and one of them, the older one, and I think Enid was the older of the two siblings.
Yep.
And she's like, they come across this cabin, this old dilapidated cabin straight out of Evil Dead. And it's in the middle of the woods. And she's like, and the older sibling in this movie is goading the younger sibling, and she's like taunting her and is like, yeah, go in the cabin, and trying to get her to go in there. And it's all scary and creepy. And eventually the little girl goes in the cabin, and I don't think we actually see what happens, right? I think we see,
no,
as it goes on, we see like the Beastman, who's this like this weird guy in the
Well, the Beastman is from another film.
Yes.
Like another horror film, right? And we start seeing like bits of him throughout these memories here as well, because I think she actually reviews a Beastman film, which is also a film directed by Frederick North, also starring the same actress that plays the younger sister in Don't Go to the Church. And that's where like Alice Lee, I think is the actress's name. And Enid kind of thinks, oh, this is similar to my childhood events, or these flashbacks that are in my mind. And so she kind of thinks that maybe Alice Lee is her sister that went missing, because she's thinking, oh, we look kind of similar or something, right?
Yeah, she looks at her and is like, oh, we look kind of similar. And these events, because this is the thing, right? You're never quite sure, because Enid is like getting these flashbacks, but they're happening kind of interspersed with these movies she's seeing. So you're never sure like which came first, right? Is it that she's getting these flashbacks, or is that these films are influencing her? And so she's starting to kind of fill in the blanks in her own memory with these bits and pieces of the film she watches, right?
Yeah, exactly. It's just like, what is fueling what here? It gets a little confusing, and there's some, I think the first like dream sequence occurs. And I'm not sure if this is out of the plot line here that we're sort of following, but she has a TV on, like, so the TV comes on in her room. She goes downstairs and it's like full of static.
Oh, I love that transition where like the TV static, and all of a sudden it's like the camera's zooming in on the static, and the static kind of gives way to an actual shot.
Yeah. And I think that shot itself might be the second static TV that we travel into, but it's like the first static TV earlier in the film kind of gives way to a more coherent flashback for her, which kind of serves as a dream that is also mixed in with actual like events from the movie she just watched. As you can see, like, it gets a little confusing at first, right?
Sort of, yeah, where she's having like her flashbacks seem to be aligning with the events of the movie. And so she starts to become really convinced that this actor, Alice Lee, is her long lost missing sister, and that potentially director Frederick North is like potentially abducted her and and is now using her in movies. She doesn't meet Frederick North up front. She's introduced to these films specifically because of the producer there, Doug something.
All I have written down is Doug. I think it's Doug Smart.
Doug Smart, played by Michael Smiley, who you probably recognize from other movies as well.
You'll recognize him when he comes on screen, yeah.
Yeah, 100%. He's this really greasy, seedy film producer, but he's the one who introduces Enid to Frederick North's work. And so in her growing obsession, she goes to Doug Smart's house to confront him, because she's like, I need to know who Alice Eve is, and like if she can unravel her background and prove that that's her sister, then she can get that closure. But there's a misunderstanding. One thing leads to another, and she accidentally kills him.
Yes. It's one of these things, like he's basically a sleazeball. He's coming on to her pretty hard.
Oh, yeah.
And she kind of pushes him backwards, and he falls onto his coffee table where he just placed one of his like horror movie trophies that has a nice big blade on it. And I mean, I won't spare you the details here, but it goes through the back of his head, comes out his mouth, and he dies on this thing.
There's a not so subtle imagery of this man being killed by one of his own awards for one of these video nasties.
Yeah, exactly.
Literally, it's penetrating his brain.
Yeah. But it's also it's unsettling as well, because this horrific accident death just happens. And throughout the movie, Enid, for lack of a better term, like centers herself, where she's kind of like rolls and cracks her neck a little bit. So at this point, she kills this guy, and she also throughout the movie will like scratch her shoulders. And so she does both actions at this point. She scratches her shoulders and cracks her neck, and just continues into like this conversation like this guy isn't dead, and then just walks away.
Well, you can see that when in her editor mode or in her censor mode, that she's able to maintain that emotional detachment, right? And you can see that there, where she's obviously troubled by his death, but she's also like, her obsession for her sister takes precedence, right? And she's able to, in a very kind of unsettling way, she's able to emotionally detach herself from this real world violence, the same way she was able to emotionally detach herself from that on-screen violence. And so there's like you said, there are some very specific visual cues to kind of show that Enid is going into censor mode and emotionally detaching herself from the situation. So essentially she's, what the other character said, she's kind of censoring out in her own brain, right? She's doing that kind of narrative editing in her own head in order for her to keep on functioning, man. And that's where you start to get the real depth of the psychological horror and what's going on with the movie, right? It's really, it's really, at the same time, it's like over the top violence, but these really subtle, this really subtle psychological unraveling of this person. So there's all these threads being slowly pulled, where you can see Enid's descent into madness.
I absolutely love that sequence. So she is, she's in their censor mode. She goes back to the office, I think, after that killing. And I can't remember exactly what she's doing there, but she kind of barges into another viewing with a couple of the other censors. And she's, kind of acting a bit strange. Her coworkers are just like, well, okay. She leaves the room, and I love this line where the other censor, he just says, well, someone is losing the plot.
Yeah.
And it's like, at that point, the plot of this movie really does go off into, okay, like, are you going to be able to follow this or not, right? I just love that kind of, it's like a self-referential thing happening there. But essentially her whole goal there, and I think before he died, Doug kind of said, we are, like, Frederick North is making he's making a sequel to Don't Go in the Church. And he kind of reveals the location of that. Is that right?
Yeah. So he says it's going to be Alice Lee's final film. And it's always left this kind of ambiguity. But I think in Enid's mind, like filling in the blanks, like, oh, her final film is like, is she just like, her career's over, or are they planning on killing her? But you can see like she's getting stressed out about this, because she's like, am I going to lose my sister again? Right. Or like, even though she's not sure that this person actually is her sister. But yeah, she does find out the location for the film shoot of this latest film, and she drives out there, And there's like there's this trailer on this property.
Like the production trailer, yeah.
Yeah, the production trailer. It's like, it's low budget, so it's just like this small trailer. And she's just kind of like lurking outside for little bits. And then I think the makeup artist slash costume designer slash she's a woman of many hats, but she comes out of the trailer and says, "Oh, you're late." It's like mistaking her for another actor who's supposed to be in the film. And like Enid's acting all weird, and she like reaches on the ground and grabs a rock.
Yeah.
At that point,
like she's gonna have to defend herself or something.
Yeah, she's acting really kind of sketchy. But like that, from this moment on, like everything starts to get more and more surreal. Where even the makeup slash costume woman who comes out, she's acting kind of weird too, right?
Yeah.
Where everything's kind of like off, and it's like if you saw somebody acting like Enid would, you would have run back in the trailer. As a normal person, is like, this is insane. Like, I'm not going to get bludgeoned by a rock lady, working on a low budget film like this is not worth it. But for her, it's just like, she's looking at this erratic behavior and it's like, no, come on in. We'll get you all fixed up for your movie. No problem.
Yeah.
And so it was like, in the name of tracking down her sister, Enid like reluctantly goes in the trailer, gets fitted for her costume and gets her hair and makeup done and all this stuff.
Completely bananas. I think at one point, the costume there's a photo of Alice in the production trailer as well.
Yep.
And the lady there, like the costume designer, basically says, "I don't think you look like this girl in the picture."
Yeah, because Enid brings it up, it's like, don't we look a lot alike? And she's like, not really?
Yeah, not really, right? So it's like, okay, that's a bit strange. And I think that's important because earlier in the film, when Enid first meets Doug Smart, the producer, he stops and looks at her and says, "Oh, you look really familiar."
Yes.
Right? And then you sort of piece together that he has seen Alice, who he thinks looks like Enid, right? But now we have this conflicting thing where this girl who does makeup and stuff doesn't think they look similar.
Well, I think there's some ambiguity there because later on when she's at Doug's place there before she kills him accidentally, it's manslaughter, not murder.
Yep.
Or self-defense, I guess, because he was gonna assault her. He was gonna sexually assault her, so that was definitely self-defense, but still gruesome. It casts doubt on whether or not he actually thought she looked like Alice or whether it was just like a sleazy kind of come on line, right? It's like, oh,
that's right.
Have you been in movies before? Right? It's like this really sleazy pickup line, and the whole thing is like, could she have just misconstrued this guy's sleaziness in a desperate attempt to fill in those blanks in her head? It's like, oh,
exactly, yeah.
Where she's like, almost like that kind of conspiracy theory-esque kind of just like taking these points of data and trying to find some kind of correlation, right?
And then the film goes into a whole other world here. So basically, Enid is now in full costume and she's kind of like going out towards the set.
Yeah, so she's in the middle of the woods. And there's like one like lit up portion with some floodlights, and she's just like wandering through the woods and like with no direction to this lit up area.
Yeah. And she finally meets Frederick North, the director, who's basically sitting there in shadows, like expecting her, saying, I can't remember if he says you're late or something, but they start having this conversation. And she is essentially confused because she's not an actress. She's not an actress of this movie. But the director starts directing her, and it's just like, you need to get into the right frame of mind. And he starts kind of trying to motivate her in different ways. And she's pretty cold at first. She's like, no, like I don't know what's going on here. And she does start getting emotional when she starts talking about her sister. And the director, North, is just like, okay, good. We're going to use that emotion and get started on this film. As this is happening, as soon as she's in costume, the film does something,
I love it,
really interesting, but I can't get enough of the aspect ratio. Slowly gets more confined. It starts reducing in size. It essentially just brings in the sides into essentially a black box. Like
essentially it brings down from like standard. Was it be anthropomorphic or would it just be like letterboxed? I don't know. Whatever.
It's just like a letterbox. Like when you're watching
9?
This on your widescreen TV, you have black bars on the top and bottom. This is the aspect ratio of the movie that you've accepted. And it starts bringing in those sides. So now you're kind of like looking at a square image, but it's fully framed in black bars on the top, bottom, left, and right.
It almost ends up like it almost ends up like in a 4:3 ratio, though.
Exactly. And I think that's there to mimic the frame size of the low budget film of Don't Go in the Church and Don't Go in the Church
Yeah,
too, right?
because the whole thing is like other points in the movie when things have gone into dream sequences or when they've been watching the movie, that aspect ratio changed as well in the movie. So all of a sudden it's like you're being given these really neat visual cues. It's like, oh,
Mm-hmm.
things aren't, this may not be the reality that we've been following, right? Whereas like
Yeah.
it's like this may be getting into either filmland or dreamland or both.
Yeah. So the shooting of Don't Go in the Church 2 begins, and I'm not sure if you picked up on this other change, but we're already at the proper aspect ratio. But I think the frame rate changes when we're in filming mode. So the filming mode is basically Frederick North controlling the camera, and she's coming into the cabin, and they are acting like they're going through the scene. And she sees Alice there, and she gets really emotional. Go ahead there.
No, it feels like the film stock actually changes. So like you're getting that
Yes.
almost like grainy look, right? Where it
Yep.
was almost being
It gets
shot on like
grainy.
old like 8mm or something, right?
Yeah, it gets grainy. I wouldn't be surprised if the frame rate dropped from like the standard 24 to like 15 or 18 or something. Like I noticed a lot of stuff changing there. And essentially, I think she gets really emotional. She sees the, what is it? The demon guy? Sorry, not, she sees Beast
Beastman.
Boy, Beastman. Yeah. Which is great because he's in other movies. And she cannot separate her fantasy from reality at this point. She's thinking, oh, this is my sister. Alice is my sister. Beastman has taken her. She picks up an axe and starts going at him. And he yells out, this isn't part of the script. And she proceeds to brutally kill him with the axe, right?
Oh yeah.
And at that point, everyone starts screaming. I think the makeup person is there off screen.
Well,
Alice is screaming. It's just like things are crazy at this
it's
point.
kind
Go
of neat
ahead.
because like the same cabin, right, from the other movies or the other visions, and she grabs an axe and she goes inside and she sees her sister, or who she thinks is her sister, right? This character played by was it Alice Lee?
Yep.
And then the Beastman comes over and she thinks that Beastman's going to like attack
Mhm.
this other actor, but instead he like embraces her and it's like almost like they're in love or like they're friendly, but she still like she goes out with the axe, and all this whole time all we're seeing is like Beastman, Enid and Alice. But then like you're saying, as soon as she starts attacking Beastman with the axe, and then all of a sudden it pulls back and kind of all of a sudden when the camera shifts around again, you see it's like, oh, there's a director and there's the crew who are recording this. Is like, and you're like, all of a sudden it's like, did she just actually kill an actor on stage? Not on stage, but like in the middle of a shoot. I was like, and all of a sudden it's like, yeah, like questioning reality. And like, and you're like, was that a movie? Was that a memory? Was that a hallucination? And all of a sudden it's like, this is where you're really like going down the rabbit hole with Alice here.
Yeah, it's pretty wild at that point. I don't even remember what happens, but something significant happens where Beastman is kind of dead, but like there's like a face that emerges from his dead body.
Oh yeah.
And starts talking to Enid. Is that right?
Yeah, and then what happens next is she takes the axe and swings it around and cuts off Frederick North's head.
That's right. Yeah.
I'll remember that image to the day I die.
Yeah, that was pretty wild. And that looked just like it came out of a cheap 80s horror film. I loved every second of it.
Oh yeah. Even the prosthetic there where his head was missing, it looked like that could have been out of Evil Dead for sure.
Oh my goodness. So I think like Alice, like the actress Alice, runs out of the cabin.
Oh yeah,
Enid runs after her.
Yeah, she bolts. Enid chases her with the axe in hand still.
Yeah, I mean, from Alice's perspective, it's like, oh, this lady is nuts. Like, I'm gonna get murdered out here. She just killed 2 other people in this production. But
maybe
Enid is still convinced.
Maybe she didn't.
Yeah, maybe she did. Maybe she didn't. And really, it's just like, what happens? They encounter each other in the woods. I mean, Alice is terrified, but from Enid's perspective, like she is saving Alice.
Yeah, she's still. So from Enid's perspective, she's still utterly convinced that Alice was her sister, Nina, who disappeared years ago, who was kidnapped and
Mhm.
who's now working on this movie. And so she's still thinking like, oh, I'm going to save you. But like Alice is obviously looking at, it's like, here's this crazy lady who came to set, killed one of my co-stars with an axe, is now chasing me through the woods with the same axe. I was like, this lady's she's nuts. She's going to kill me. And so there's a bit of dialogue back and forth. And like Alice, I think, runs away again. And then you see all of a sudden in Enid's hand is the video control that she would use when
Yes.
she would watch these movies as she was censoring them. And also there's another kind of visual clue to what's going on, where she like takes this control and she starts like presses these buttons. And then things really go off the rails at the end. Not off the rails, but things get even more kind of wacky here, as
Yeah.
I think from my interpretation, it's Enid going kind of into those further depths of madness here.
Yeah, without it, I interpreted it the same way. So I think it might be important that aspect ratio was maintained until North, the director, yelled cut, and we are shockingly brought back to the full
Yes.
aspect ratio of the regular movie, which the rest of the movie plays out in. However, there's a lot of distortions and kind of like film issues going on every so often. And it's just at one point, like Alice, the actor, says, "This isn't real." And we see sort of like a disturbance in the film that we're watching. And it's like Enid kind of like overrides that, right? And it plays out like, oh, this is a kind of nice fantasy. And we literally see the two of them walking off into the woods in bright light, like everything is a nice happy ending.
Yeah.
And I think at that point it goes to her parents on the street. There's literal rainbows in the sky. Her parents are super happy. Enid has saved the day. Enid has brought Nina back. Everyone is happy, but the film keeps cutting in and out of this gray, like sad reality where her parents are crying and everyone's upset. And my interpretation is Enid is just overwriting that with her own fantasy at that point.
I think they pull up in a car, right?
Possibly. I don't remember.
I can't remember, but it's Enid and Alice still in their costumes from the movie, still covered in fake, potentially real blood. And then like Alice runs across the streets to, I take it, their childhood home with their parents standing out in front, and they're all smiling. And Alice runs over, the happy family reunited. But as you're saying, like every once in a while, there's this bit of static, and it cuts to like Alice changes to like she's screaming in terror, but then it kind of like blurs and static and cuts back, or it cuts like her parents kind of like you're saying, like there's a bit of static, and it's like it's this gray. It's almost like there's a film underneath the film that's kind of poking through, and it's like her parents are like crying uncontrollably, but then it kind of cuts back to this happy, rainbow Technicolor ending where this family is reunited, and Enid is across the street still covered in blood in this costume from the movie. And I think she like slowly turns around away from her family, but she's like smiling really creepily at the camera. And then the ending comes up where it's like it cuts to here's this VHS player and it pops out the movie itself called Censor, and then it goes to the credits.
Yeah. So what did you think of that very last moment when the movie Censor comes out of the video cassette deck there?
Okay, so to be honest, I was watching this and I had to kind of cognitively recalibrate a little bit because I was expecting a more straightforward ending.
Yeah.
And so it took me a little bit to change gears to get on board for the more ambiguous ending. And I was like, I started watching, I was like, oh, this doesn't really fit. But I was like, it's too ambiguous. I was like, that's how I sounded in my own head, my past self. But then I remember stuff like Donnie Darko, one of my favorite movies. Like it doesn't make, like you can watch that and not have a lick of sense, or like you can watch it and like not have any clue what's going on. It's like, this doesn't make any sense, but I still love that movie. So I had to kind of recalibrate as like, put it in that context of like that more, that ambiguity and interpretation. So the ending kind of caught me a little bit off guard, but the more I think about it, the more I really like the way they did that, where they didn't specifically spell everything out. They took a really artistic approach to kind of, they built it all up. And so that ending felt like there was enough narratively anchored before that that last, I guess, 20 minutes or
Yeah.
so, that is like, okay, I can follow. There's enough evidence in here that I can reasonably take that ending, which gets super trippy, and make a reasonable interpretation of my own based on the evidence that I have, but it's left open to interpretation. And I really, really like that. And that whole ending scene in this kind of like, Leave It to Beaver kind of, like 50s sitcom perfect world with this kind of other, almost like two movies, like one placed over the other one, and like the almost like reality trying to get through fantasy. I thought it was like really, really super creepy and really well done. It's like, even though it's bright sunshines and rainbows, but it's like the whole thing was like super unsettling.
Yeah, man, the execution was perfect. I was, like I said before, I was pulled in from the very beginning. And when it got in like that 60-minute mark, like that sequence where we talked about, she pulls up to the production of the movie, like within a movie, I think was at the 60-minute mark. It's literally 24 minutes of
pure insanity.
Pure insanity. Yeah. I mean, I have no other words for it. And I was absolutely loving every second of it. It's just like, I'm really enjoy it when a movie can present that type of feature to me. And I think you nailed it there when you said it gave you enough hints and like it laid down the groundwork beforehand to give you the ability to interpret it as you will. And I like that it didn't treat us, with kid gloves on, like it treats the viewer as an intelligent person who can make up their own mind, and that doesn't need to be force-fed every little thing. It's just like, I'm so used to a lot of blockbuster films that are designed for big theatrical box office openings, and initial audience reaction is so important because they just need that box office return immediately. It's like, I need these types of movies to bring out the film lover in me, right? It's just like they are still making movies for non-box office audiences.
Yeah, where it forces you to use your brain when you're watching, right? Whereas they don't have exposition man come on screen and explain. It's like, oh yeah, Godzilla is awakened by the nuclear energy because of X, Y, and Z. It's like, yeah, we just saw that on screen. You don't need to explain it to me again. It's like,
there really was no exposition here at all, was there?
Well, there's
not really
your standard exposition, but there weren't exposition machines whose sole purpose was just to tell us what's going on. It's like, no, here's what's happening. And you're, as the viewer, it's up to you to piece these clues together and to come up with your own interpretation of what's going on. And to and even if it doesn't lend itself to multiple interpretations, it's like, I like that it wasn't a literal ending. Because if you just would have had a literal ending that was straightforward, it wouldn't have had the same kind of impact. But the fact that it was so surreal, and there was that ambiguity about what's real and what's not, that really lent itself well to the themes of the film, but also just to the film itself and structurally and visually. It just worked really, really well, better than a kind of more conventional ending, right?
It was incredible. I really enjoyed a lot of different aspects of the film. Obviously, the plot and the setting of the film, the context of it. I mean, it's a film about films, and it's about the film industry in a light that I haven't really seen before.
Yeah,
I've seen some documentaries on film censorship and whatnot, but I think it was more of a North American angle. And seeing this from the UK, it was just really fascinating that the stuff was going on. And it makes a lot more sense where, in the 2000s, I'm discovering, especially over the past 5 or 6 years, I'm discovering a lot of these video nasties for myself. They weren't on my radar before, right? Now I can go through that list and say, I've seen a bunch of these without really knowing that they were, previously banned films. And when these movies come out on home video, like DVD or Blu-ray now, we get these different cuts of the film. It's like, where do these different cuts of the movie come from?
Yeah.
There's a UK cut, and it's because they were released in the 80s to different levels of censorship. And it was just really fascinating. I loved some of the throwbacks here to a lot of these Giallo films I've been watching with the lighting.
Yeah.
Specifically in the woods. She's going through the dark woods, but there's red spotlights coming out of the woods. Yeah, I mean, it doesn't make any sense why there'd be a red spotlight out there. It just looks cool, right? And I can really appreciate that stuff. There's a lot of work there early on that I noticed where it was pretty claustrophobic. Like they're inside their office. I don't think there's any windows in their office, which makes sense for they're reviewing movies. But every bit of their office is claustrophobic. Her commute home is through the London tube system, I'm guessing, where it's just these long tunnels. And that's claustrophobic, right? She's on a subway surrounded by 50 people. That's claustrophobic. There's just a lot there that seems to lend itself to someone losing their mind, right? She has a routine to go through, and she has to sort of turn her emotional core off to objectively censor these films. But stuff is going to get through the cracks. It was just absolutely wild.
No, it was really great. Like you said, it was a very kind of oppressive atmosphere, which really worked to mimic kind of, essentially mimic Enid's psychology or her psychological state, right?
I just want to make mention of the amnesia killer in the movie that this is the guy who killed his wife and ate her face, right? Later on in the movie, it's kind of a throwaway line in the background. A couple of the censors in the background, like her coworkers, are talking about it, like they're reading a news article, and said, oh, the guy didn't even watch the movie, right? So it's just like, it just sort of shows you how quick the news and these organizations were to jump on films as the blame for all these violent acts. And we see the same thing mirrored now, especially, I think for me at least, growing up with video games and seeing in the 90s North American video games get rating systems and a lot of violence being blamed on them. And we find out, oh, these kids haven't even played these video games, right?
Yeah.
But they're still the blame, and they suffer the repercussions of censorship and restricted sales and the whole 9 yards.
Yeah, it was also interesting too in the film. It kind of showed that kind of subculture, right, where Enid is trying to track down some more films by Frederick North, and she goes to the one like this. It's also nice to see. Is like, I remember those old video stores and going. Like that brought back some memories. But she goes to the guy at the counter and she's like, I'm looking for certain kinds of movies, and she's kind of beating around the bush, and he's like kind of playing dumb. But it's like, no, under the counter, all these banned films he's got copies of, and he rents them out to a certain select clientele. So it's like almost like an underground kind of move, almost like a resistance movement, right? Like a cultural kind of artistic resistance movement where like the government's saying, they're treating us like children, we can't watch these. It's like, no, we're gonna have our own. All it does is like drive it underground, and people are going to watch them anyway.
I like that she has to like pull out her film nerd knowledge.
Yeah.
By like proving that she has seen these movies. Like she's seen all these movies. Right. But it's just like she has to throw out a bunch of violent, horrific acts that are in one of the films to prove to this guy, oh, I've seen, like, this woman has seen this stuff. She is on the inside. She's good to rent to.
Yeah. Proving that that gatekeeping is not a modern phenomenon.
That's exactly, yeah.
So that's interesting. Having to prove your street cred, but also it's almost like, being in that kind of in that inner circle is like you say the right words. It's almost like a password to get in, right? But in order to know the password, you have to already be in, right? So it's like this weird kind of catch-22 where it's like if you're not part of that circle, then you're not. You can't become part of the circle, but in order to become part of the circle, you have to be in the circle. It's like that Old Spice ad by Bruce Campbell. It's like, if you have it, you need more of it. If you don't have it, you never had to begin with.
It's interesting because she's fascinated by the Frederick North movie. She wants more of it. And they have an archive of these films at her office. And there's a lady that works the archive.
Oh, yeah.
And Enid goes there just like, can you bring up what other films North has done? And the lady's like, well, do you have a list of these movies? I was like, no, I don't. I don't know what else he's made. He's like, well, it's going to take at least a week to find these movies. It's just like, what kind of pre-internet crazy world do we live in here, right? It's like, it was difficult to find it, but it's like, these weren't by any means popular films. Like, these are underground indie exploitation films to begin with.
Yeah.
It's going to be difficult to even keep track of all this stuff. I like that angle as well. Yeah, no, there's a lot to love about this film. So what was your interpretation then of the events? How do you interpret the ending and the whole movie in general? How does that ending recontextualize the rest of the movie, if at all? Well, I watched the movie for the first time a couple weeks ago, And I kind of just let these movies wash over me, and I don't try and read too much into them. And it felt really good. I absolutely fell in love with it. I've said it too many times now. I rewatched it last night before we recorded this, and I was trying to focus more on, what does this mean? And I really took out of it that, yeah, she basically just got lost in her own psychosis there, right? I really feel like when we get the static TV screens, we're being transported into these fantasy sequences with her. The entire last sequence is layering a film on top of a film. I think you said that earlier. I love that term, where it's just like these events are happening at the same time, but her brain is interpreting it completely differently. Like she's living in her own film now, right? It's her own fantasy. And so I really think, like, if there's any question on did she actually kill those people, was it part of the movie? No, I think she legitimately killed those actors. I think she just got lost in her own mind, and possibly the end of the film where she's at home with the sister is just like, maybe they came out of the woods or something near this house with her parents. Police are pulling up. I don't know. It doesn't even matter at that point. It's just, that's the fantasy that she's going to continue living in no matter where she is now. Like, there's no more layering happening there, right? It's just like she's in pure fantasy now.
Yeah, so my interpretation of the film was, like, I think I was overthinking it the first time I went through it.
Yeah.
And it wasn't until later, it's like, no, it doesn't have to be super, super complex. It can be complex an idea without being overly complex kind of narratively. So essentially what happened, I think, everything that happened up until that film shoot, right? That was her, that was reality, right? She really lost her sister. She was in the woods. Something happened that traumatized her, that caused her to have that memory loss. And she's been coping with that mental illness ever since, right? Where she can't remember that. And that trauma has affected her a lot more deeply than she even realizes. I think that's part of her ability to remain detached, right? Has been part of her coping mechanism. I think that her emotional attachment from watching these films and censoring them, I think, is meant to show kind of an unhealthy detachment where she literally can't engage with these horrific acts, right? She can't process them. So she has to keep herself at arm's length, right? Because you see that as soon as she starts to, engage with them on any real meaningful level, everything starts to unwind, right? She sees those movies and they trigger something in her traumatized mind, whether or not, her and her sister actually found a cabin in the woods or there was a man or anything. I think that's open to interpretation. But what we do know is that she went in the woods with her sister one day. Something happened. Something traumatic happened. Only Enid was able to come back. We assume alive, not assume alive, that Enid is alive and that her sister, we're assuming that she's actually dead, right? Or potentially missing. And then her parents are trying to cope with it, and Enid's not able to process this properly because of that unresolved issues with her trauma. And then when she gets to the shoot, right, all of a sudden is that fantasy and reality really start to, because of her obsession, they start to overlap and kind of they're interchangeable. And she goes to that set. She really thinks that Alice Lee is her sister. But then she goes to the set and she's lost in this fantasy world. She kills that actor. She really kills the director. And then she chases Alice out into the woods. And then that whole ending essentially is I think like you said, was just like her brain trying to process this. And it's essentially censoring out the things that she doesn't want to remember or can't deal with, and overwriting or editing those with a reality that she can take. So that's right. She's, whether or not, I like to think that an ending is like, yeah, she actually kidnaps Alice and brings her to her parents' house in reality.
Yeah, that
and she's
makes
like,
sense. Yeah,
I found my sister, Mom and Dad.
Yeah.
And that's why you see like that gray kind of underlying reality break forward. Was like Alice is like, I don't know what's going on. Her parents are like, like they're seeing their daughter break down, or they're seeing like her bring this complete stranger, and it's like, look, I found my sister. And like, so like you see that. So
that makes a lot more sense.
I think that that's more vague, and that's just my own interpretation. But that whole ending is like, yeah, she's lost in her own delusions. Essentially, she killed those people on that movie set.
Yeah.
Because she couldn't mentally because she compartmentalized for so long, and then her fantasy and her reality came crashing together when she tried to process it again. And then she killed the people in the movie set, and then she just went completely, I guess, certifiably insane, right?
Yeah.
Where she couldn't tell reality from fantasy anymore by the end of the movie.
Yeah. And I think her fantasy really got kickstarted when her parents provided the death certificate for her missing sister, right? Because she wasn't ready to let go. That wasn't any kind of closure for her. That's when she really needed to get her own closure. And it kind of coincided with the Frederick North film that she had to review.
So there was the perfect psychological storm, right? Where there was this catalyst where it's like, no, all of a sudden there was like almost like a ticking clock for her. It was like, no, I have to prove that she's alive as soon as possible to counteract the death certificate, where she desperately needed her to be alive. Okay.
I'll throw this at you, where Frederick North wanted her to specifically watch that film, right? Now, it had been previously established that they knew who was watching which films, and there was a little bit of, just a couple of lines about, who leaked bad information from the office, right? It's like, did she possibly leak it herself? You know what I mean? It's just like her coworkers suspect that she is doing something like that. But when she meets Frederick North, they have this conversation. And at one point he says, all of my movies are based on true events, which is either something that she needed to hear or she latches onto, but it's something the audience, like the viewer, can say, okay, does he actually know her? Like, does he know about her past, right? And it's like, that's really weird. And then one quote I pulled out that he said is, take control of your story, which she does 100% afterwards. Is she is now living in her own fantasy world. She's taking control of that story.
Right. I think it's really interesting because they're really throwing that ambiguity in there where you see afterwards what Frederick North was actually doing is that he's saying all these things to try and get his actor into this emotional state that he wants. Whereas like, is it any of what he's saying actually true? I mean, he could just be making that up to get her into character, right? So like, and take control of your own story. So all of a sudden she's starting to take these things like literally, right? Where she's that's a great example where she's in this mental state where she can't separate out reality and fantasy, and she's taking things literally, right? But that's another kind of great kind of meta commentary, is like, take control of your own story. And even the clue at the end where she's literally holding, out of nowhere, she's holding that device that she, like the video control device where you could like easily rewind stuff to rewind the movie to watch it over and over again from her control booth. It's like, that was an obvious clue, I think, where it's like, we're no longer in, even though the aspect ratio of the movie switches back out to the quote unquote reality, I think that's meant to show that at that point, it's like, you're seeing these fantastical elements in the aspect ratio that's associated with reality. So all of a sudden you're seeing, it's like, oh yeah, fantasy is bleeding over into reality now, where like she literally has taken control of her own story, right? Where she's like, it is actually amazing how much the human brain can edit out when it doesn't want, right?
Absolutely amazing. I think you summed it up and articulated it really well there. I mean, I couldn't say it any better, but I absolutely agree. What an incredible film. With that, I mean, I know we both recommend the film from earlier, but what is your star rating? Out of 5 stars, what do you give this thing?
So my initial star rating was 4 out of 5 stars, and I have the sneaking suspicion that that's going to sneak up as I rewatch this again.
I wasn't really sure. I thought, I know we've been talking about disagreeing on films every so often. It's like, oh, maybe I've found a film that Nathan may not enjoy as much. And it's just like, no, man, we are enjoying this just as much. Now, I gave this movie 4.5 stars on first viewing. I did watch it again. I can't think of a reason why I would knock a 0.5 star off of it. So maybe it's a 5-star movie for me. It's definitely a phenomenal film. I would love to pick this up on home video when it comes out. If it comes out
on home video, own it on home video today.
I want to get this thing on video cassette.
That'd be awesome.
But absolutely incredible. Highly recommended. Just great film, and I'm just looking forward to what this director does next. It was just great. Yeah, I'm very motivated to go find her short films now. It's not something I usually go out and try and do, is find short films to see where a lot of these feature films come from, because quite often short films are kind of a proving ground for directors. You know, it might be 10 or 15 minutes and it gets enough attention and justifies a big budget, or I shouldn't say big budget. I don't know what the budget of this film is, but it was enough for a studio to give her some money and realize this vision in full. Really fantastic.
Yeah, highly recommend for lovers of horror, but also lovers of movies in general. I like that. I'm not always, I don't know, as a movie lover, yeah, sometimes I'm on board with movies about movies. Sometimes they can be a little, maybe bordering on pretentious. But this one was like, it was a horror movie in its own right, but it was also this great love letter to horror movies and a specific era of horror movies. So it was really nice to see that in there. So if you're a lover of horror movies, or if you're a lover of movies about movies, I think that this is a really unique take on, you know, like linking that, you know, that psychological thriller aspect with, you know, trauma, and using censorship / editing as a metaphor for the human mind dealing with trauma in different ways. Right. That was, just again, it was great. It was a horror movie with substance. And I think, I mean, up there for me, in the kind of modern pantheon of horror films, with films like Hereditary and Midsummer and The Endless and Resolution, all kind of more like horror films with, you know, quote unquote something to say, but like some substance and some depth to them, right? So you can have horror, and you can have it, you know, actually explore kind of real world themes, right? And it's really great to have that depth of enjoyment. You can enjoy it on a visceral level for the blood and the gore and the psychological, you know, unraveling of another human being, which is weird to say, but you can also enjoy on that level of, you know, explorations of trauma and you know, psychologically trying to cope with life events that are too difficult to process, maybe, right? Or really, really difficult events in your life. And that's like, I think that kind of multiple layers of meaning really adds to the enjoyment of this film.
And that's a wrap on another episode of the Real Film Chronicles. Thank you so much for listening and hanging out with us today. We're having a great time putting these together and love sharing these episodes with you. We can be found on a few platforms, including Facebook, Twitter, and Letterboxd, all of which are linked in the show notes. You can also reach us by email, and of course, you can find our website at realfilmchronicles.com. Until next time, take care of yourselves and others, and keep that film journey going.